Well, you know what? If you don't have affirmative action, if you don't have any consideration of anything, and you just do it by scores, there will still be people with perfect scores who don't get in. Because there are just that many people who want in. So it's important to think about the big picture here and understand that part of what drives this is we're not thinking about how to expand the overall number of seats, and especially public education such as this, which despite tuition climbing unconscionably is still a relative bargain. To have public education of this quality with Nobel laureates, with the people who stand on this stage and lecture to you, it's amazing. And yet, we continue to underfund the UC system, and funding keeps going down. So the first point is to understand some of this is an artificial fight because the resource is so constrained, and if there were more of the resource, that would lessen some of the anger. Although not all of it, because there's also another piece to this, which is if Harvard were open admission, people wouldn't want to go there. So I just want to acknowledge something about human nature. Part of what we like, part of the reason people want to compete for the most elite institutions is because they have that prestige founded on their exclusivity. So there's a perversity here to it, right? The more exclusive you make it, the more people clamor for it, the more people are rejected, the angrier they get, right? But this is in part caused by constrained resources. The second point is, and this is different than Asia, the second point is test scores are just predictors. And I'm not making an ideological claim. This is unrelated to affirmative action, but unrelated to race. If you go and you ask the people who make the SAT, right, there's actually a job. Maybe some of you are psychology majors. You can be a psychometrician. That's a job where you design standardized testing. Okay? And it's true for the LSAT, it's true for the MCAT, it's true for every single test that's high stakes in America that we administer for the purpose of sorting students. Okay? They predict performance at the next level up. What do I mean by this? So high school students take the SAT, and it's validated scientifically in conjunction with grades. It's not the world's best predictor on its own, but with grades, and I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I am not a radical who says test scores don't mean anything. They do mean something. Here's what they mean. Statistically, you can take grades and test scores, and in the aggregate, with big data, with enough of you, you can reasonably predict, based on grades and test scores, roughly, in a really rough way, what will happen with big numbers. It's really hard to predict as to this person or that person, but once you get 100, once you get 1,000, once you get 10,000, okay, then you can make a robust prediction that of the 10,000 people who got perfect SAT scores, as compared to the 10,000 people who got average SAT scores, as compared to the 10,000 who got abysmally bad SAT scores, that a much higher proportion of those with perfect SAT scores will end up toward the top of the class as undergraduates, and so on and so forth. You can predict in the aggregate, roughly. You can also predict things such as bar passage and so on and so forth. But here's the catch. It's really rough. If you sat down with someone who designed one of these tests, and without regard to race, so I'm not talking about, is this good for African Americans or Asian Americans or whoever, without regard to race. And you said to them, how much does 10 points on the test matter? They would laugh at you and they would say, that doesn't matter at all. What's shocking is even when you get up to about 100 points, it's not clear that that matters very much at all. So these tests are just predictors, and if you really want to predict, one of the most robust predictors of your educational attainment is your parents, specifically your father's educational attainment, and these tests also correlate to wealth. All right, so these are just factual statements. You can make of this what you will, and you might say, okay, well, fine, we're prepared to live with that. But nobody would suggest, or nobody has suggested, that college admission should be premised on your wealth, that we should just admit the wealthiest students. Yet, understand that using grades and test scores, to some extent, it's very similar to saying we're just going to sort people on the basis of wealth, roughly. Right? The other aspect of merit is it doesn't just come in one form. Again, separate from the effect that Asian Americans or African Americans, if we just admitted students based on grades and test scores, we would end up with a much weaker class. Look, I've got no self-interest in saying this, all right? I'll disclose that. I did not have a perfect SAT score, but I was in about the top 1%. So you want to sort out the world and award goodies based on test scores? All right, I'm all for it. I'm going to do pretty well, all right? But that would be bad. I now realize as a leader and a manager that there are all sorts of things: resilience, leadership, sense of humor, ability to work on a team that you don't capture that you need in society, that are forms of merit that you can gauge with other proxies that your math and verbal scores on SAT really don't tell you very much about. This is very different than Asia. So in China, you have the Gaokao, and in Japan and Korea, you have similar tests, high-stakes testing, where people there really believe this is an intrinsic measurement of merit, and they're prepared to accept a society that's structured on the notion that at the age of 16, 17, or 18, you'll take this test, and it will more or less, in a much more rigid way than even US news rankings would cause here, it assigns you a station in life, not just the institution you'll attend, but the major that you'll have. Well, no disrespect to China, Japan, Korea. The ascent of Asia is one of the most remarkable aspects of global history. But America is not founded on the premise that we should have the Gaokao or something like that that assigns us a station. For so many of us, especially Asian Americans, we exist because our parents left those regimes because they weren't the ones who thought that they would be most successful under that system. And that in part is what is so important to realize about merit. It's a fascinating study that was done about merit where white students at selective institutions were asked, should admissions be based on test scores? And some of you in this room are studying a social science field. So one of the things you can do with a survey like that is you can do something called priming. You can tell people, by the way, just a little preface in advance, the things I'm saying right now. Here's what's very interesting. If you say to white students and elite institutions, we're doing a little survey about how admissions should work, and you say, by the way, did you know that white students score better on average than black students if there's a test gap? And then you ask them, how should admissions be based? Guess what they think is merit? Test scores, of course. They're advantaged by that. But if you just change the sentence before you take the survey, and you say, hey, by the way, Asian Americans on average do better than whites. Oh, and how do you think admissions should work? Their enthusiasm for test scores goes down quite dramatically. The point is, this is true of me, it's true of all of us. We all assess merit based on what we think is going to favor us. So it's no surprise that people who do really well on tests think that tests are more meaningful than they are. Tests are tests. They do tell us something, but they have limited utility. And part of what we should ask, and maybe society is going to go in a different direction. Maybe everyone else in this room thinks, yes, we should assign a station in life based on test scores that people get at the age of 16, 17, or 18. If you want to go that way, I'm fine with that. But that's not the system that we've decided on because we, especially at a campus like this, know that people bring to the table so much more than their SAT score. That's not the sum total of what you can contribute to society. The third and last prefatory point is something that is overlooked by just about everyone, even Asian Americans. So this is a point specifically about Asian Americans. This is just a factual statement, right? You can look it up, and it varies depending exactly how you define it. There are trends over time. But there's something important you should know about Asian Americans, which is if you just look at the applicant pool at Harvard or any applicant pool to any selective college in America, the proportion of Asian Americans in the applicant pool is much higher than the proportion of Asian Americans in the general population. Asian Americans are overrepresented. They're disproportionately represented in the population of people who go to four-year undergraduate institutions. Now, why am I telling you this? Because, and some of you here have STEM backgrounds, or at least you're good at math. I could joke and stereotype about how you're Asian, so you're good at math. But understand something. Whatever policy Harvard has, whatever policy the UC system has, it will disproportionately affect Asian Americans, disproportionate relative to Asian Americans in the general population. Why? Because they're overrepresented in the pool. Let me be concrete about this. Let's say Harvard tomorrow, let's say a dorm burns down, okay? And they say, oh, it's going to take us some time to rebuild this. We don't want to put students into a hotel. We're going to have to admit 100 fewer first-year students next year than we usually do. We don't have enough space. We're going to reduce the class size by 100. Well, guess what? Reducing the class size by 100 will have a significant, disproportionate effect on Asian Americans, not because anyone wants to discriminate, not because it's bigoted, but because the proportion of Asian Americans in the pool is different. I note that because now I'm going to turn to the Harvard case. The Harvard case is not a smoking gun case. It's a case based on statistics. So to understand the case, I'll pick up where the very kind words at the outset ended, that none of this is new. Okay? So let's get into the Harvard case. And I'm going to start someplace a little different. Jewish students in the 1950s. Okay? Actually, I think it was a UC Berkeley professor who wrote the definitive book on this subject. The Ivy League institutions had a quota. They had a cap. They had what was called a gentleman's agreement to limit Jewish students post-World War II. Jewish students were admitted to Harvard and Yale and Princeton. They just weren't admitted in the numbers that they would have been admitted in if they weren't capped. Now, bear in mind, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and elite schools like that back then were all male, and they admitted disproportionately students who went to elite East Coast prep schools. You know, when I was a kid, I didn't even know there was any such thing as schools on the East Coast that were residential that you went to for high school that were as well endowed as Ivy League institutions, where you had the types of classes taught by people with PhDs, almost like college, except everyone was 4 years younger and about a foot shorter, you know? But that's how those Ivy League schools were fed, overwhelmingly and disproportionately from schools like Andover and Exeter. And I'm not knocking those schools, I'm just noting nothing about the system post-World War II would be considered fair today, from the all-male aspect to that students came so heavily from prep schools to the preferences for alumni, which we'll return to in a moment. Let's talk about Jewish students, though. The Jewish students faced a quota. They faced an upper limit. Here's what's really interesting about that. And many people say today, Asian Americans are just like Jews. They're the new Jews. And in fact, you go and you look at any of these debates, okay, so if you do the historical work, go back and read the Jewish intellectual magazines, Commentary, Dissent. Look at what Jewish writers were saying 2 generations ago, 40 years ago. Okay? Before the Bakke case was decided, Jewish organizations were debating affirmative action, good for us, bad for us, which side should we come out on, and Jewish nonprofit groups, community groups filed briefs on both sides in Bakke and have continued to do so in all the cases.